there are two villages called Oradour-sur-Glane. One is alive. People drive through its streets. Families live there. Shops open in the morning. Children go to school. But only a short distance away is another Oradour, and that one has been dead for more than 80 years. The streets are still there. The houses are still there. The church is still standing. But there are no families inside those homes. No voices behind the windows. No shopkeepers opening their doors. Because France made an extraordinary decision. Instead of rebuilding the village after it was destroyed, they preserved the ruins. Not a replica. Not a museum reconstruction. The actual village. And to understand why, you have to go back to one afternoon in June 1944. Oradour-sur-Glane was a quiet village in central France, not far from the city of Limoges. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors. There were cafes, shops, schools, workshops, and houses lining narrow streets. A tram connected the village with Limoges. Life continued even as war consumed much of Europe. Then came June the 10th. Only 4 days earlier, Allied forces had landed in Normandy. France was still under German occupation, and resistance activity was increasing. That afternoon, soldiers from the Nazi Das Reich division entered Oradour-sur-Glane. At first, many residents did not understand what was happening. The soldiers surrounded the village. People were ordered to gather in the central marketplace. Men, women, children, families were pulled from their homes. People working nearby were brought into the village. Children were taken from school. Nobody knew exactly why they had been assembled. Then the soldiers began separating them. The men were divided into groups and taken to barns, garages, and other buildings around the village. The women and children were taken to the church. Imagine standing there and watching your family disappear in another direction. You do not know where they are going. You do not know what is happening. You do not know that these could be the final moments you will ever see them. Inside several buildings, the men were positioned together. Then the shooting began. The soldiers opened fire. Afterward, the buildings were set alight. A small number of men survived by hiding beneath bodies or escaping through burning structures. But for most, there was no way out. At the church, hundreds of women and children were trapped inside. Something was placed inside the building that began producing smoke. Confusion spread. Then gunfire erupted. The church was set on fire. Only one woman is known to have escaped from inside the church and survive. Her name was Marguerite Ruffenche. She climbed through her window and fell several meters to the ground. Wounded, she managed to crawl away and hide. Around her, the village burned. By the end of that day, almost everyone who had been gathered in Oradour-sur-Glane was dead. The official number of victims is now recorded as 643. Entire families disappeared. Children, parents, grandparents, people who had simply been living an ordinary Saturday morning hours earlier. The soldiers did not just kill the residents. They destroyed the village around them. Homes were looted. Buildings were burned. Cars were left damaged in the streets. The church became a blackened shell. The next day, soldiers returned. Attempts were made to burn and conceal bodies. For investigators, identification became incredibly difficult. And when the war finally ended, France faced an unusual question. What should be done with Oradour-sur-Glane? Normally, after a destroyed town is liberated, rebuilding begins. Walls are cleared. Homes return. Roads are repaired. Life slowly starts again. But that was not what happened here. France decided that the destroyed village should remain. In November of 1944, the provisional French government decided the ruins would be preserved. Then Charles de Gaulle visited Oradour-sur-Glane in March of 1945. The message became clear. The ruins were not going to disappear beneath a new town. They would remain as evidence. A new Oradour-sur-Glane was built nearby. So today there are effectively two villages. One represents life continuing. The other represents the afternoon when life stopped. Walk through the old village today and that contrast becomes difficult to ignore. You enter streets that still follow the same paths they followed before the massacre. But there are no roofs over many of the buildings. Walls end suddenly against the sky. Windows look into empty rooms. Rusting machinery remains among the ruins. Old shop fronts can still be identified. The remains of workshops sit beside abandoned houses. And then there is the church. Its roof is gone. Its interior is empty. The stone walls remain. Visitors can stand in the same building where the women and children were held. Nothing needs to be recreated. Nothing needs dramatic decoration. The ruins themselves tell the story. And that is what makes Oradour so unsettling. It does not feel like a normal historical site. It feels unfinished. Like everyone left and never returned. But they did not leave. Their village was taken from them, and France intentionally refused to erase what remained. There is another strange part of the story. Preserving destruction is much harder than it sounds. These buildings were never designed to stand without roofs for decades. Rain enters the walls. Winter frost cracks the stone. Plants grow through damaged structures. Metal rusts. Mortar weakens. Brickwork collapses. The village is slowly being destroyed for a second time. Except now, the enemy is time. French conservation teams face an almost impossible problem. If they rebuild too much, the village stops being authentic. If they rebuild nothing, the ruins eventually disappear. So the goal is not to make Oradour look new. It is to keep the destruction intact. Walls are strengthened. Dangerous sections are stabilized. Vegetation is controlled. But evidence of fire, bullets, and collapse is deliberately preserved. That means every repair has to answer the same strange question. How do you save something without fixing it? More than 80 years after the massacre, that question has become increasingly urgent. The ruins continue to deteriorate. Officials have warned that preserving such a large destroyed village requires constant work. And Oradour is not just one building. The protected site covers a huge section of the old settlement. Street after street. Home after home. Ruined businesses. Public buildings. The church. Together they form something extremely rare. An entire community preserved at the moment of its destruction. There are also small details that make the site feel even more haunting. A rusted car remains inside the old village. Tram tracks are still visible in places. Signs identify buildings that once belonged to ordinary families. You can look through a doorway and realize that decades ago, somebody cooked dinner there. Someone slept upstairs. Someone opened that shop every morning. Someone expected to return home that evening. They never did. That is the real power of Oradour-sur-Glane. The ruins are not frightening because they are abandoned. They are frightening because they were once completely ordinary. There was nothing mysterious about this place before June the 10th. It was not built as a battlefield. It was not a military base. It was a village. That is why France preserved it. Not to create an attraction, not to create a legend, but to leave physical evidence of what happened when violence reached an ordinary community. Even today, walking through Oradour creates an uncomfortable feeling. The new village is close. Modern France exists just beyond the ruins. Cars move. People talk. Life continues. But cross into the old streets and suddenly, the calendar feels different. You are surrounded by a place that France deliberately refused to allow time to erase. The buildings were never rebuilt. The church was never restored to normal. The streets were never returned to the families who lived there. Instead, another town grew beside the ruins. One Oradour moved forward. The other remained behind. And now there is a race that nobody can completely win. Because even stone does not remember forever. Walls collapse. Metal disappears. Nature returns. Every year, keeping Oradour frozen in 1944 becomes harder. Eventually, preservation becomes a battle against the same thing that destroys every abandoned place: time. But perhaps that is also part of what makes the village so powerful. Oradour-sur-Glane was never supposed to survive forever. Neither were the buildings. Neither were the streets. What France preserved was not perfection. It preserved damage, silence, absence, and the physical outline of a community that vanished in a single afternoon. So, if you ever see photographs of this strange, ruined village in France and wonder why nobody rebuilt it, the answer is simple. They could have. France chose not to. The new village was built beside it, and the old one was left standing as a warning. 2 villages, 1 name, 1 alive, and 1 still trapped in June 1944.